The Arizona air felt unusually tense that morning, even before anybody said a word. Inside the Brown family, tension had become almost normal over the years, but this felt different, quieter, heavier, like everybody sensed something emotional was coming before they even sat down together. And according to people close to the family, nobody was more unprepared for what happened next than Kody Brown himself. Because the request he received that afternoon wasn't dramatic at first. Nobody yelled, nobody stormed out. There were no explosive accusations. Just one calm conversation that slowly turned into something emotionally much bigger than anyone expected. Sources say the entire situation started during what was supposed to be a routine family discussion, involving scheduling, future plans, and ongoing communication between different branches of the family. At least, that's what Kody reportedly believed walking into it. But according to insiders, one family member had arrived carrying a completely different emotional purpose. And once the conversation shifted, the emotional atmosphere in the room reportedly changed immediately. Because the request being made wasn't about logistics, it was personal. Very personal. And insiders claim it caught Kody emotionally off guard in a way viewers rarely see publicly. One source close to the family described the moment this way. At first, he thought it was just another family conversation. Then he realized this was something much deeper emotionally. The request reportedly centered around rebuilding emotional trust between certain members of the family after years of growing distance, unresolved tension, and emotional separation. But according to insiders, the way the request was phrased made it especially difficult for Kody to process, because it reportedly forced him to confront something he has struggled emotionally accepting for a long time. The family no longer sees emotional connection the way it once did. And according to sources, hearing that reality spoken aloud created an uncomfortable silence almost immediately, especially because several family members apparently agreed. Over the past few years, the Brown family dynamic has changed dramatically following the emotional collapse of multiple relationships inside sister wives. What once operated as one interconnected plural family now reportedly feels more like separate emotional circles loosely connected through history and shared children. Some relationships remain close, others feel distant, and according to insiders, several adult children increasingly want more emotional honesty instead of pretending everything still functions the way it did years ago. That emotional shift reportedly became the center of the conversation that day. Sources claim one family member calmly explained that simply staying in contact no longer feels emotionally meaningful if deeper issues remain ignored under the surface. And according to insiders, that statement visibly affected Kody. Because while he reportedly expected occasional tension following divorces and family restructuring, sources say he genuinely believed time would naturally soften many emotional divisions eventually. Instead, several family members now appear to want direct emotional conversations about the past before moving forward. And insiders claim that reality feels overwhelming for Kody privately. One source reportedly explained, he thought people mostly wanted peace. He's realizing now some people want emotional accountability first. That difference reportedly created immediate emotional tension during the conversation. Because according to insiders, Kody still struggles with the idea that different family members experience the same years together in completely different emotional ways. While some remember unity and sacrifice, others remember loneliness, favoritism, emotional neglect, or distance. And sources claim hearing those emotional perspectives directly remains difficult for him even now, especially when the request reportedly became more specific. According to insiders, the family member eventually asked Kody for something he did not expect at all: consistent private effort. Not public statements, not family meetings, not generalized promises. Personal effort. One-on-one communication. Emotional presence. And according to sources, that request reportedly hit Kody harder than anyone anticipated. Because insiders claim he immediately realized the conversation was no longer about fixing the family as a whole. It was about repairing individual emotional relationships separately. And that emotional reality reportedly forced him to confront how fragmented the family has truly become. One insider described the moment this way. You could almost see it hit him emotionally that the old family structure doesn't exist anymore. That realization reportedly changed the tone of the entire discussion. Suddenly, the conversation became less about blame and more about emotional grief.
grief over lost closeness, lost trust, lost routines, lost connection, and according to insiders, several family members quietly became emotional during the conversation, even though nobody intended the meeting to become confrontational. Because underneath all the tension, many relatives reportedly still deeply miss the emotional version of the family they once believed would last forever. Meanwhile, sources say Janelle Brown tried helping keep the conversation emotionally grounded as things became heavier. According to insiders, Janelle increasingly acts as one of the few people capable of calming emotional escalation during difficult family discussions. Rather than focusing on blame, sources say she encouraged everyone to focus on what kind of relationships they actually want moving forward, instead of endlessly reliving the past. But according to insiders, even Janelle admitted privately that rebuilding emotional trust now feels far more complicated than anybody expected years ago. Because time did not automatically heal everything. Distance did not erase unresolved feelings, and adulthood reportedly changed how many children emotionally interpret their upbringing inside the Brown family. That emotional reevaluation appears to be affecting nearly everyone lately. Meanwhile, Kody Brown reportedly remained mostly quiet during parts of the conversation, but listened carefully as emotions surfaced. Sources say Kody has increasingly focused on protecting her emotional peace since rebuilding her life independently after leaving the plural marriage structure. However, insiders also claim she still cares deeply about the emotional well-being of the broader family despite everything that happened over the years. One source reportedly explained, "She moved on romantically, but emotionally she still wants in the family." That emotional contradiction reportedly exists across many relationships inside the Browns now. People no longer want the old structure back, but they still mourn parts of the emotional closeness they lost when everything changed. And according to insiders, that emotional confusion may be the hardest part of all. Because nobody fully agrees on what family is supposed to look like anymore. Some want more boundaries, some want deeper honesty, some want peace without reopening old wounds. Others believe healing cannot happen with difficult conversations first. And according to sources, Kody suddenly found himself sitting in the middle of all those conflicting emotional needs at once. That's reportedly why the request affected him so deeply. It wasn't only unexpected, it forced him to emotionally recognize that rebuilding the family now requires something very different than maintaining the family required years ago. Back then, the focus was structure. Now the focus is emotional trust. And according to insiders close to the family, Kody may finally be realizing just how difficult rebuilding that trust could become after everything the Browns have already lived through together. After the conversation ended, insiders say the emotional atmosphere inside the Brown family remained tense for days. Not explosive, not openly hostile, just emotionally unsettled. Because according to people close to the family, the request made to Kody Brown forced everyone present to quietly confront a painful truth they had spent years trying to avoid. The family cannot simply return to what it once was. And emotionally, that realization reportedly hit different people in very different ways. Some family members felt relieved that difficult emotions were finally being acknowledged openly instead of ignored. Others reportedly worried the conversation might reopen emotional wounds that had barely started healing. But according to insiders, nobody left the discussion unaffected, especially Kody. Sources claim he spent the next several days unusually quiet and reflective while processing everything that had been said. One insider reportedly explained, "He walked into that conversation thinking it would be practical. He walked out realizing people are grieving emotionally in ways he didn't fully understand." That emotional realization reportedly weighed heavily on him. Because according to insiders, Kody genuinely believed maintaining occasional contact, attending family events, and keeping communication somewhat open meant relationships still had a strong emotional foundation underneath. But the request he received reportedly challenged that assumption completely. The family member who spoke up apparently made something very clear during the discussion. Surface-level connection no longer feels emotionally enough. And according to insiders, hearing that perspective directly was deeply uncomfortable for Kody because it forced him to emotionally separate the idea of family contact from actual emotional closeness. Those two things apparently are no longer the same inside the Brown family. Meanwhile, several adult children reportedly began discussing the conversation privately afterward as emotions continued spreading through different branches of the family. According to sources, many of the Brown children increasingly feel caught between emotional loyalty to the family and honesty about unresolved pain connected to the past. That emotional balancing act has become harder over time, not easier, especially as adulthood gives people more emotional distance and perspective about their upbringing inside sister wives. One insider reportedly explained, "When they were younger, survival and family unity came first. Now people are asking deeper emotional questions. Questions like, what relationships actually feel emotionally safe? What emotional wounds never fully healed? What kind of family dynamic should exist moving forward? And how much honesty can relationships survive?" Those emotional questions reportedly now shape nearly every major family interaction behind the scenes. Meanwhile, Kody Brown reportedly continued thinking about the conversation long afterward too. According to insiders, Christine understood immediately why the request affected Kody so deeply. Because sources say she went through a similar emotional realization herself years earlier when she first began accepting that emotional needs inside the family were no longer being fulfilled through structure alone. One source close to Christine reportedly explained, "For a long time, everybody believed staying together automatically meant emotional closeness. Eventually, some people realized that wasn't always true." That realization reportedly became one of the emotional turning points leading to the family's current situation. And according to insiders, more relatives are now arriving at similar conclusions, even if they process them differently. Some become more vocal, others emotionally withdraw. Some try rebuilding individual relationships privately, others create stronger boundaries. But sources say nearly everybody inside the family now agrees on one thing. The emotional version of the Brown family that existed years ago no longer functions the same way today. That emotional shift reportedly became impossible ignoring after the request made to Kody. Because according to insiders, the conversation forced everybody present to stop talking about the family.
In the days following the emotional conversation, insiders say something unusual started happening inside the Brown family. People began reaching out privately, not publicly, not for social media, not for appearances. Real conversations, quiet check-ins, unexpected messages. And according to sources close to the family, that emotional shift surprised several relatives, including Kody Brown himself. Because while the original request had caught him off guard emotionally, insiders claim it also forced him to think more deeply about relationships he may have unintentionally allowed to become distant over time. One source reportedly explained, "The conversation stayed in his head longer than people expected." According to insiders, Kody spent several nights afterward reflecting privately on how dramatically the family dynamic has changed since the earlier years of Sister Wives. Back then, the family's biggest challenge often seemed logistical, managing multiple households, balancing schedules, financial pressure, parenting responsibilities, and maintaining the structure itself. But now, insiders say, the challenge feels entirely different. Now the struggle is emotional. How do you rebuild closeness after emotional trust weakens? How do you reconnect with adult children who experienced family life differently than you did? How do you apologize for pain you may not have fully recognized at the time? And according to sources, those questions reportedly began weighing heavily on Kody after the request was made, especially because the family member who spoke up apparently wasn't asking for perfection. They were asking for effort. Consistent effort, emotional presence. And according to insiders, that distinction mattered more than Kody initially realized. One source explained, "It wasn't about fixing everything overnight. It was about showing people they emotionally matter individually." That idea reportedly shifted something emotionally for him. Because insiders claim Kody suddenly recognized how much the original plural family structure depended on collective identity rather than individualized emotional connection. The focus had always been the family, the system, the structure, the unity. But according to sources, many family members now want something much more personal emotionally. They want relationships that exist beyond obligation, beyond shared history, beyond television. And insiders say that realization feels overwhelming and emotional for multiple people inside the family, not just Kody. Meanwhile, Christine Brown reportedly viewed the conversation as emotionally important, even if uncomfortable. According to sources, Christine privately believes the family spent many years prioritizing functionality over emotional honesty simply because survival required it at the time. One insider reportedly explained, "When the family was huge and chaotic, people didn't always stop to process emotional damage while it was happening. Now, however, life looks completely different. The households are separate, children are adults, the structure changed. And according to insiders, emotional reflection has naturally become unavoidable, especially for adult children now raising families of their own." Sources claim several of the Brown children increasingly compare their own parenting experiences to the emotional environment they grew up in, not necessarily with anger, but with new perspective. That emotional perspective reportedly shapes many current family conversations quietly behind the scenes. Some children reportedly feel grateful for parts of their upbringing while still carrying unresolved emotional pain from other parts. And according to insiders, expressing both emotions simultaneously has become one of the biggest challenges inside the family now, because many relatives still struggle emotionally with the idea that love and hurt can coexist in the same relationship.
Meanwhile, Janelle Brown reportedly continued acting as a calming presence as emotions spread through the family following the conversation. Sources say Janelle increasingly encourages family members to stop viewing emotional honesty as automatic betrayal. According to insiders, she believes avoiding difficult emotional conversations for years contributed heavily to the family's current disconnect. However, sources also claim Janelle understands why people remain emotionally cautious, because vulnerability inside the Brown family now feels risky. Anything emotional can quickly become misunderstood, personalized, reopened publicly online, or emotionally overwhelming. That fear reportedly still affects communication constantly. One insider described the atmosphere this way: people want honesty, but they're terrified of what honesty might change. That emotional contradiction reportedly defines much of the family dynamic today, especially because the original request to Kody reportedly sparked different emotional reactions from different relatives. Some family members felt hopeful. Others reportedly worried the conversation would create expectations impossible fulfilling emotionally after so many years of tension. And according to insiders, several adult children privately questioned whether emotional rebuilding is truly possible once trust weakens deeply enough. That uncertainty reportedly weighs heavily across the family now. Meanwhile, Kody reportedly made a decision in the days after the conversation that surprised several people close to him. According to insiders, he began reaching out privately to certain family members individually, instead of waiting for group gatherings or major family events. Not dramatic conversations, not confrontations, just small personal communication. And according to sources, those efforts reportedly mattered emotionally more than he realized. One insider explained, for some people, the fact he even tried meant something. Still, insiders also claim the responses varied significantly. Some relatives welcomed the effort warmly, others remained emotionally cautious, and a few reportedly struggled trusting whether meaningful long-term change was actually possible. Because according to insiders, many family members now fear emotional inconsistency more than conflict itself. Promises have happened before. Temporary improvements happen before. But sustained emotional effort reportedly feels much harder maintaining long-term, especially once life becomes busy or tension resurfaces again. That emotional skepticism reportedly explains why the original request affected the family so deeply. It wasn't asking for one emotional moment. It was asking for ongoing emotional commitment. And according to insiders, that kind of request forces everybody to confront uncomfortable truths about what relationships currently exist, and which ones may need rebuilding almost from the beginning. Meanwhile, sources say several family members quietly started reflecting on whether they themselves had emotionally withdrawn over time too. Because according to insiders, emotional distance inside the family did not happen through one single event. It happened gradually, through years of unresolved tension, shifting priorities, emotional misunderstandings, hurt feelings, defensiveness, exhaustion, and changing family structures. That complexity reportedly makes assigning simple blame nearly impossible. One insider explained, everybody feels hurt somehow. Everybody also contributed somehow. That emotional gray area reportedly frustrates many fans online who continue searching for simple heroes and villains inside the Brown family story. But according to insiders, reality remains far more emotionally complicated than internet narratives suggest. Because despite everything, the divorces, the conflict, the public tension, the emotional distance, most family members reportedly still love one another deeply. And that's exactly why the pain continues feeling so intense. If the relationships no longer mattered emotionally, rebuilding wouldn't feel this difficult. But according to sources close to the family, many relatives are now realizing something emotionally important. Love alone does not automatically rebuild trust. Trust requires consistency, effort, emotional accountability, presence. And according to insiders, that's the deeper emotional meaning behind the request that caught Kody so off guard in the first place. It wasn't asking him to restore the old family structure. It was asking whether he's willing to emotionally rebuild relationships one person at a time, even if the family never fully becomes what it once was again. As more days passed after the emotional conversation, insiders say the atmosphere inside the Brown family became strangely quieter than usual. Not calmer, just quieter. According to people close to the family, everyone seemed to be emotionally processing something privately at the same time. The original request made to Kody Brown had done more than create one uncomfortable discussion. It reportedly forced multiple family members to rethink what emotional connection actually means now that the original family structure has changed so dramatically. And according to insiders, those questions are becoming harder to avoid. Because for years, the Brown family operated around the idea that staying together physically meant staying connected emotionally. Now, however, many relatives reportedly no longer believe those two things are automatically the same. That realization has become emotionally difficult for several people, especially Kody. Sources claim he has become increasingly reflective since the conversation, sometimes withdrawing quietly after family interactions, instead of immediately trying to fix tension or redirect discussions. One insider reportedly explained, he's starting to realize people wanted emotional closeness, not just family organization. According to sources, that distinction feels emotionally overwhelming for him because so much of his identity inside Sister Wives centered around maintaining the structure itself, managing schedules, keeping households functioning, balancing responsibilities, holding the family together practically. But insiders claim several relatives now feel emotional needs were sometimes overlooked underneath the pressure of maintaining that enormous structure. And according to sources, hearing that perspective repeatedly has become increasingly emotional for Kody privately, especially because some adult children reportedly began expressing similar feelings after hearing about the original request. Not necessarily anger, not explosive confrontation, more emotional honesty. One insider described the shift this way: people aren't trying to destroy relationships anymore. They're trying to explain how certain experiences actually felt emotionally. That difference reportedly matters deeply inside the family, because according to insiders, several relatives spend years avoiding emotional honesty out of fear it would automatically create division. Now many people seem to believe avoiding difficult conversations may have created even more emotional distance over time instead. Meanwhile, Janelle Brown reportedly continued encouraging relatives to approach these emotional conversations carefully but honestly. Sources say Janelle increasingly believes healing inside the family depends on people learning how to discuss pain without turning every conversation into blame. However, insiders also claim she understands why emotions remain fragile, because once emotional trust weakens inside a family this large, rebuilding it becomes incredibly complicated. One source reportedly explained, "The Browns spent decades functioning as a group. Now everybody's learning how to connect individually." That emotional transition feels unfamiliar for nearly everyone involved, especially because relationships inside the family now operate without the routines and structures that once kept people constantly connected. No shared household, no constant family gatherings, no unified daily life. And according to insiders, physical distance has forced many people to confront emotional realities they previously ignored while living inside the chaos of the larger family system. That emotional clarity affects adult children especially strongly. Sources claim several children now recognize they spent years prioritizing peacekeeping and adaptation emotionally because the family environment required.
As the emotional tension inside the Brown family continued evolving, insiders say one realization slowly became impossible for anyone to ignore anymore. The family was no longer trying to save a structure. They were trying to save relationships. And according to people close to the family, that emotional distinction changed everything. Because for years, much of the focus inside Sister Wives revolved around maintaining the larger plural family identity itself, keeping households connected, keeping communication functioning, keeping traditions alive, keeping the idea of unity intact, even during emotionally difficult periods. But now, insiders say, many relatives increasingly care less about preserving appearances and more about whether relationships actually feel emotionally healthy on an individual level. That shift reportedly became especially emotional for Kody Brown, as recent conversations continued forcing him to confront emotional realities he had never fully processed before. One insider reportedly explained, "He's starting to understand that some people emotionally disconnected long before the marriages officially ended." According to sources, that realization deeply affected him because he previously believed most emotional distance developed after the family physically separated into different lives and households. Now, however, several relatives reportedly describe emotional disconnection beginning years earlier, during periods when the family still appeared united publicly. That emotional contradiction reportedly continues weighing heavily on Kody, because insiders claim he genuinely remembers many of those same years as periods of sacrifice, hard work, and commitment toward keeping the family functioning. Meanwhile, some adult children reportedly remember emotional loneliness during those exact same years. And according to sources, realizing how differently people experience the same family life has become emotionally overwhelming for him at times, especially after several recent private conversations reportedly became more emotionally vulnerable than anything the family typically discussed in previous years. One insider described the change this way: "People stopped talking about what the family looked like and started talking about how the family emotionally felt." That emotional shift reportedly transformed the tone of many relationships almost immediately. Because once people began discussing emotional experiences honestly, certain patterns became harder ignoring. Patterns like emotional inconsistency, favoritism, feeling overlooked, emotional withdrawal, unresolved resentment, and communication that slowly weakened over time. Not every family member agrees completely about those issues, but according to insiders, the willingness to discuss them openly at all marks a major emotional turning point for the Browns. Meanwhile, Christine Brown reportedly believes the family is finally confronting emotional truths that should have been addressed years ago. According to sources close to Christine, she increasingly sees the current tension not as evidence the family failed entirely, but as evidence that emotional honesty was postponed for too long. One insider reportedly explained, "Christine thinks people survived emotionally by avoiding certain truths. Now avoidance no longer works."
That emotional reality reportedly affects older and younger generations differently. Some older family members still instinctively prioritize peacekeeping and emotional restraint. Many adult children, however, reportedly feel more willing to prioritize emotional transparency, even when conversations become uncomfortable. And according to insiders, that generational difference now shapes many difficult interactions behind the scenes, especially because younger relatives increasingly believe emotional closeness requires openness, not silence. Meanwhile, Janelle Brown reportedly continues acting as one of the few people capable of helping conversations stay emotionally balanced during tense moments. Sources say Janelle increasingly encourages everyone to focus less on proving who was right emotionally, and more on understanding how different experiences shaped people over time. According to insiders, she believes healing becomes impossible once conversations turn into competitions over whose pain matters more. One insider explained, Janelle keeps reminding people that multiple emotional truths can exist at the same time. That perspective reportedly helped calm several recent conversations that initially risked becoming emotionally defensive. Because according to sources, one of the family's biggest struggles now is learning how to validate emotional experiences without automatically interpreting validation as blame. And for Kody especially, insiders say that distinction remains emotionally difficult sometimes, because hearing painful emotional experiences connected to years he personally viewed as sacrifice and dedication creates enormous emotional conflict internally. One recent conversation reportedly affected him deeply. According to insiders, one adult child calmly explained that emotional hurt inside the family often did not come from dramatic moments. Instead, it came from accumulation. Missed emotional opportunities, inconsistent communication, feeling secondary emotionally over long periods of time. And according to sources, Kody reportedly became unusually quiet afterward, because insiders claim he suddenly realized some relatives no longer judge relationships based on isolated moments. They judge them based on emotional patterns built over years. That realization reportedly shifted something emotionally for him. One insider described it this way. He stopped asking, "What big thing did I do wrong?" and started asking, "What emotional needs did people repeatedly feel missing?" According to insiders, that emotional shift may be one of the most significant developments inside the family recently. Because for the first time in a long time, Kody reportedly appears more focused on listening than defending himself immediately. Still, sources say rebuilding emotional trust remains extremely fragile. Some family members reportedly appreciate the recent effort and honesty. Others remain emotionally cautious because past cycles of tension, reconciliation, and disappointment left deep emotional scars. That skepticism reportedly especially exists among relatives who spent years emotionally adjusting themselves in order to maintain family stability. Now, many reportedly fear reopening vulnerability only to feel emotionally dismissed again later. One insider explained, "People want emotional consistency now, not temporary emotional repair." That expectation reportedly continues reshaping nearly every important relationship inside the Brown family. Because emotional consistency requires something much harder than occasional reconciliation. It requires sustained effort over time. And according to insiders, that kind of emotional rebuilding still feels unfamiliar territory for many relationships inside the family after decades centered around structure and survival instead. Meanwhile, some relatives reportedly remain uncertain whether complete emotional healing is even realistic anymore. Not because they stopped loving each other, but because too much changed emotionally over too many years. According to insiders, several family members now privately wonder whether healthier boundaries may ultimately matter more than recreating closeness exactly the way it once existed. That emotional question reportedly hangs quietly over the entire family now. Can relationships evolve without fully returning to what they were before? And according to sources, nobody inside the Browns fully knows the answer yet. Still, insiders say one thing became undeniably clear after the request that originally caught Kody off guard. The family can no longer survive emotionally through avoidance alone. People want honesty, emotional presence, reliability, accountability, and relationships that feel genuine rather than performative. And according to insiders, whether the Browns ultimately heal or continue drifting apart may now depend entirely on whether those emotional needs can finally be met consistently moving forward. As the emotional aftermath of the request slowly settled across the Brown family, insiders say something became increasingly clear to nearly everyone involved. Nothing inside the family would ever fully return to the way it once was. And according to people close to the Browns, that realization felt both heartbreaking and strangely freeing at the same time. Because for years, many relatives reported onto the hope that eventually things would stabilize emotionally, and the family would somehow feel united again the way it once appeared during earlier years of sister wives. But now, insiders say, more family members are finally accepting a difficult emotional truth. The future of the Brown family may not depend on rebuilding the old structure. It may depend on creating entirely new kinds of relationships instead. And according to sources, that emotional shift began with a request that unexpectedly shook Kody Brown so deeply. Because the request was never really about fixing public image, or recreating the past, or pretending old wounds never happened. It was about something much simpler emotionally. Showing up consistently, being emotionally present, making relationships feel intentional again instead of automatic. And according to insiders, that message continued lingering heavily in Kody's mind long after the original conversation ended. Sources say he has spent weeks quietly reflecting on how much family life changed over time without him fully recognizing the emotional consequences while living through it. One insider reportedly explained, "He always focused on holding the family together. Now he's realizing some people emotional connection more than structure. That realization reported a level of emotional vulnerability many relatives had rarely seen from him before. Because according to insiders, Kody genuinely believed love, sacrifice, and family commitment would naturally keep relationships emotionally strong over time. Now, however, several relatives increasingly believe emotional closeness requires much more than shared history alone. It requires consistency, emotional attention, communication, reliability, empathy, and emotional accountability. And according to sources, accepting that shift has been emotionally difficult, but important for nearly everyone inside the family. Meanwhile, several adult children reportedly continue processing years of complicated emotions connected to their upbringing inside the plural family system. Not with simple anger, not with total rejection, but with emotional complexity. Because according to insiders, many children still deeply love their family while simultaneously recognizing emotional experiences that affected them in painful ways over time. That emotional contradiction reportedly defines much of the current atmosphere inside the Browns. Love mixed with grief, connection mixed with disappointment, hope mixed with caution. And according to insiders, learning how to hold those emotions together honestly may ultimately determine what kind of relationships survive moving forward. Meanwhile, Kody Brown reportedly believes the family's recent emotional honesty, despite how uncomfortable it became, may ultimately help certain relationships become healthier than they were before. According to sources close to Kody, she increasingly sees emotional transparency as necessary even when it temporarily creates tension. One insider reportedly explained, Kody thinks people finally stopped confusing emotional silence with peace. That realization reported how many family members now approach communication altogether. Instead of automatically hiding discomfort to preserve appearances, several relatives reportedly now believe emotional honesty may actually create stronger relationships long-term if handled carefully and consistently. Still, insiders say nobody believes the process will be easy, because emotional trust inside the family remains fragile. Years of unresolved feelings do not disappear quickly, and according to sources, some relationships may never fully recover the closeness they once had, not because love disappeared, but because emotional experiences change people permanently over time. Meanwhile, Janelle Brown reportedly continues encouraging relatives to focus less on recreating the past and more on building healthier emotional dynamics going forward. Sources say Janelle interestingly believes the family spent too many years trying to maintain one specific version of unity instead of adapting emotionally as people's needs changed. Now, however, insiders claim she sees opportunities for something different. Relationships built more intentionally, more honestly, and with clearer emotional boundaries. One insider explained, the family may never function the same way again, but that doesn't automatically mean relationships can't improve. That perspective brought some emotional comfort to several relatives still struggling with grief over how dramatically the family changed. Because according to insiders, grief remains one of the strongest emotional undercurrents throughout the Browns even now. Grief over lost marriages, lost closeness, lost routines, lost emotional certainty, and the realization that family identity itself has fundamentally changed. Yet despite all of that grief, sources insist many family members still genuinely want emotional healing. Not necessarily dramatic reconciliation, not necessarily becoming one giant unified family again, but healthier relationships than the ones currently existing. And according to insiders, that hope may be the reason people continue trying emotionally despite how difficult the process feels sometimes. Meanwhile, one final private conversation reportedly stayed with Kody more than almost anything else said during the past several weeks. According to insiders, a family member calmly explained,
As the emotional conversations continued spreading quietly through the Brown family, insiders say one unexpected thing became increasingly clear. The request that caught Kody Brown off guard had unintentionally opened emotional doors many family members didn't even realize were still closed. For years, much of the family reportedly operated in emotional survival mode. There was always another crisis, another move, another disagreement, another schedule, another relationship issue, another public controversy tied to sister wives. And according to insiders, many relatives became so focused on functioning that they stopped noticing how emotionally disconnected certain relationships were becoming underneath the surface. Now, however, the structure that once kept everyone constantly occupied no longer exists in the same way. Life is quieter, more separated, more independent. And according to sources, that emotional silence has forced many people to finally hear feelings they once drowned out through constant activity and chaos. One insider reportedly explained, when everything slowed down, people realized how emotionally far apart they had drifted. That realization reportedly affected multiple generations inside the family, especially adult children. Sources say several of the Brown children increasingly feel emotionally torn between appreciating parts of their upbringing while also acknowledging emotional experiences they struggled with privately for years. And according to insiders, learning how to express those mixed emotions without damaging relationships has become incredibly difficult. Because inside the Brown family, emotional honesty historically often carried emotional consequences. People worried about creating tension, hurting feelings, causing division, or destabilizing the family structure itself. Now that the original structure has already changed dramatically, several relatives reportedly feel less afraid of speaking honestly, but also more uncertain about what honesty might ultimately change. Meanwhile, Kody reportedly continued trying to process the emotional weight of the original request privately. According to insiders, one thing especially stayed with him after the conversation: the realization that some family members no longer measure love through proximity or family participation alone. Instead, they reportedly measure it through emotional consistency, personal attention, reliability, feeling emotionally prioritized. And according to sources, that shift challenged Kody's understanding of family connection more deeply than he expected. One insider explained, "He spent years thinking holding the family together physically was the biggest proof of love. Now people are asking for emotional intimacy instead." That emotional transition reportedly feels overwhelming for him at times, because according to insiders, emotional intimacy requires something much harder than family organization: vulnerability, listening without defensiveness, consistency over time, and perhaps most difficult of all, accepting emotional experiences different from his own. Meanwhile, Kody Brown reportedly continued observing the family's emotional evolution carefully from a more emotionally grounded place than in previous years. Sources close to Kody say she now recognizes many emotional patterns inside the family much more clearly after gaining distance from the plural marriage structure. One insider reportedly explained, "When you're inside survival mode, you don't always realize what emotional needs are being neglected." According to insiders, Kody believes many family members, including herself at one point, became so focused on keeping the family functioning that they ignored emotional exhaustion building quietly underneath. Now, however, emotional exhaustion reportedly can no longer hide behind routine or structure, especially because several adult children are beginning to speak more openly about emotional experiences connected to their upbringing. Not necessarily publicly, but privately within the family itself. And according to insiders, those conversations are changing relationships in subtle but important ways. Some relatives reportedly feel closer after finally discussing emotions honestly. Others feel emotionally overwhelmed by how much unresolved pain still exists beneath the surface. And some relationships now reportedly fluctuate constantly between connection and distance depending on the conversation. That emotional unpredictability has become one of the defining realities inside the Brown family lately. Meanwhile, Janelle Brown reportedly continues encouraging relatives not to confuse emotional discomfort with emotional failure. Sources say Janelle increasingly believes healing inside the family will require difficult conversations no matter how uncomfortable they become temporarily. However, insiders also claim she understands why many relatives remain emotionally cautious. Because once emotional honesty begins, people often fear where it might eventually lead. One insider explained, "Everybody's afraid the truth could either heal the family or finally break it completely." That emotional uncertainty reportedly hangs over nearly every major conversation now, especially because the family no longer has one shared vision for the future emotionally. Some relatives want deeper reconnection. Others want healthier boundaries. Some want accountability before closeness. Others simply want peace without revisiting painful history repeatedly. And according to insiders, balancing all those emotional needs simultaneously has become almost impossible. Still, sources say one surprising emotional development emerged after the original request to Kody. Several family members reportedly began appreciating small emotional efforts more than grand gestures. Simple phone calls, checking in privately, remembering important moments, following through consistently. And according to insiders, those small actions now carry enormous emotional meaning inside the family because trust feels much more fragile than it once did. One source reportedly explained, "People don't need speeches anymore. They need consistency." That idea reportedly changed Kody's perspective significantly, because according to insiders, he spent years believing family unity depended primarily on keeping everyone connected structurally. Now he realizes emotional closeness operates differently entirely. You cannot organize emotional trust into existence. You have to build it slowly, personally, repeatedly. And according to sources, that realization has been emotionally humbling for him, especially after another quiet conversation reportedly happened between Kody and one family member several days ago. According to insiders, the relative calmly told him something that reportedly lingered in his mind long afterward. "We stopped needing a leader a long time ago. We started needing emotional support." Sources claim Kody reportedly became very quiet after hearing that, because according to insiders, much of his identity inside the family centered around leadership and responsibility, providing structure, making decisions, holding things together. But now several relatives reportedly care less about structure and more about emotional connection itself. And according to insiders, adjusting to that shift emotionally has become one of Kody's biggest struggles privately. Meanwhile, several adult children reportedly continue debating emotionally what kind of future relationships they actually want with different branches of the family. Some reportedly feel hopeful after the recent honesty. Others remain emotionally guarded because past cycles of tension and reconciliation left them uncertain whether lasting change is truly possible.
That skepticism reportedly exists, especially among relatives who feel emotionally disappointed by previous attempts at rebuilding trust. One insider explained, "People want to believe things can improve. They're just afraid of getting hurt emotionally again." That fear reportedly shapes nearly every relationship inside the family now. Fear of disappointment, fear of rejection, fear of emotional inconsistency, fear of reopening wounds that never fully healed the first time. And according to insiders, those fears explain why the original request affected the family so deeply. It wasn't really about one conversation. It was about whether the Browns are emotionally willing to stop pretending connection automatically exists simply because they share history. Because according to sources close to the family, many relatives now believe something emotionally important. Shared history may make people family, but emotional effort is what determines whether they actually stay connected over time. As the weeks continued, insiders say the emotional ripple effects from the original request were still spreading quietly throughout the Brown family. Not through dramatic confrontations, not through explosive arguments, but through reflection, private conversations, long overdue realizations. And according to sources close to the family, several people had started emotionally confronting truths they once avoided because life inside sister wives moved too fast to stop and process them properly. Now, however, the constant chaos that once defined the Brown family no longer exists in the same way. The households are separate. The marriages changed. The routines disappeared. And according to insiders, the emotional silence left behind has become impossible ignoring. Especially for Kody Brown. Sources claim Kody increasingly finds himself thinking about moments from years earlier differently now than he did at the time. Not necessarily because his memories changed, but because he's beginning to understand how differently other people experienced those same moments emotionally. One insider reportedly explained, "He's realizing family history doesn't exist as one shared emotional experience anymore." That realization has reportedly become emotionally difficult for him. Because according to insiders, Kody spent years believing the family's sacrifices and struggles created unity automatically. But several relatives now seem to believe emotional connection requires something much more intentional than shared hardship alone. And according to sources, that difference in perspective sits underneath nearly every difficult conversation happening inside the family lately. Meanwhile, several adult children reportedly continue debating emotionally what kind of future relationships they actually want with different branches of the family. Some reportedly feel hopeful after the recent honesty. Others remain emotionally guarded because past cycles of tension and reconciliation left them uncertain whether lasting change is truly possible. That skepticism reportedly exists especially among relatives who feel emotionally disappointed by previous attempts at rebuilding trust. One insider explained, "People want to believe things can improve. They're just afraid of getting hurt emotionally again." That fear reportedly shapes nearly every relationship inside the family now. Fear of disappointment, fear of rejection, fear of emotional inconsistency, fear of reopening wounds that never fully healed the first time. And according to insiders, those fears explain why the original request affected the family so deeply. It wasn't really about one conversation. It was about whether the Browns are emotionally willing to show up consistently in the present. And according to insiders, several relatives now view that question as the true emotional test facing the Brown family moving forward. Not whether they can recreate the old structure, not whether everybody agrees emotionally about the past, but whether meaningful relationships can still survive if people finally stop avoiding emotional truth. Meanwhile, several adult children reportedly continue debating emotionally what kind of future relationships they actually want with different branches of the family. Some reportedly feel hopeful after the recent honesty. Others remain emotionally guarded because past cycles of tension and reconciliation left them uncertain whether lasting change is truly possible. That skepticism reportedly exists especially among relatives who feel emotionally disappointed by previous attempts at rebuilding trust. One insider explained, "People want to believe things can improve. They're just afraid of getting hurt emotionally again." That fear reportedly shapes nearly every relationship inside the family now. Fear of disappointment, fear of rejection, fear of emotional inconsistency, fear of reopening wounds that never fully healed the first time.
As more emotional conversations unfolded behind the scenes, insiders say the Brown family slowly began entering unfamiliar territory emotionally. For years, many relatives reportedly believed maintaining peace meant avoiding certain conversations altogether. If emotions became too heavy, people redirected. If tension surfaced, somebody tried calming things down quickly. If feelings became uncomfortable, the focus shifted back toward family unity. But according to people close to the family, that pattern has started changing in ways that now feel impossible reversing, especially after the request that unexpectedly shook Kody Brown emotionally. Because insiders claim the conversation forced everybody involved to confront something deeply uncomfortable. Some relationships inside the family may never fully heal unless people finally stop protecting the illusion that everything was emotionally okay for years. And according to sources, that realization has become both freeing and terrifying for different relatives at the same time. One insider reportedly explained, "The family used to survive through emotional avoidance. Now people are trying emotional honesty instead." That transition reportedly feels emotionally messy, because honesty does not instantly create healing. Sometimes it creates grief first. And according to insiders, grief has quietly become one of the strongest emotional forces inside the Brown family lately. Not only grief over divorces, not only grief over lost traditions, but grief over realizing how differently family members emotionally experience the same life together. Meanwhile, Kody reportedly continues struggling privately with that emotional reality. Sources claim one of the hardest parts for him has been recognizing that some adult children no longer view emotional closeness as automatic, simply because family ties exist. Instead, insiders say many now believe emotional trust must be actively maintained through consistency, communication, and personal effort. One insider described Kody's emotional state this way: "He's realizing relationships don't survive on history alone." That realization reportedly affects him deeply because so much of his identity centered around building and protecting the family structure itself for decades. But according to insiders, several relatives now care less about preserving the idea of the family and more about whether relationships actually feel emotionally fulfilling individually. That emotional shift reportedly changes everything, because maintaining a structure is very different from rebuilding emotional intimacy one relationship at a time. And according to sources, that rebuilding process feels emotionally exhausting for nearly everyone involved. Meanwhile, Kody Brown reportedly believes the family is finally confronting emotional truths that have existed quietly underneath the surface for years. According to insiders, Kody increasingly sees the current emotional tension not as sudden collapse, but as delayed emotional processing. One source reportedly explained, "The feelings people are discussing now didn't appear overnight, they just stayed buried for a very long time." That emotional backlog reportedly explains why recent conversations feel so intense. Because once years of suppressed feelings begin surfacing, even small discussions can suddenly carry enormous emotional weight. And according to insiders, several relatives now find themselves emotionally revisiting moments from years earlier with completely different understanding than they had at the time. Especially adult children. Sources say many of them now recognize how much emotional adaptation shaped their upbringing inside sister wives. Constant compromise, constant adjustment, constant awareness of household dynamics. And according to insiders, some children became emotionally skilled at minimizing their own needs, simply to keep the larger family environment stable. Now, as adults with more independence and emotional perspective, several reportedly struggle realizing how much of themselves they emotionally suppressed growing up. That realization has reportedly sparked difficult but important conversations privately within the family. Not conversations based purely in blame, but conversations centered around emotional recognition. Recognition that certain experiences genuinely hurt. Recognition that some relationships weaken slowly over time. Recognition that love and emotional pain sometimes existed simultaneously. And according to insiders, learning how to hold those truths together emotionally has become incredibly difficult for the Browns. Meanwhile, Janelle Brown reportedly continues trying to help family members stay emotionally grounded during the process. Sources say Janelle increasingly believes healing depends on relatives learning how to listen without immediately becoming defensive or emotionally shutting down. However, insiders also claim she understands why that feels challenging for many people, especially Kody. Because according to sources, hearing emotional pain connected to years he personally remembers as sacrifice and commitment creates enormous emotional conflict internally. One insider explained, "He feels grief hearing people describe emotional loneliness during years he thought he was giving everything he had." That contradiction reportedly weighs heavily on him, especially because some recent private conversations reportedly became even more emotionally direct than the original request itself. According to insiders, one adult child recently explained to Kody that emotional absence is not always about physical absence. Sometimes it's about attention, prioritization, consistency, feeling emotionally seen. And according to sources, hearing that perspective reportedly left Kody visibly emotional afterward. Because insiders claim he genuinely never intended for any child to feel emotionally unimportant inside the family. But several relatives now appear increasingly willing to discuss how intentions and emotional impact are not always the same thing. That emotional distinction reportedly represents one of the family's biggest challenges moving forward. Because many people still love each other deeply, yet they remember certain experiences completely differently emotionally. Meanwhile, some family members remain emotionally cautious about how much honesty the family can actually survive long-term. Sources say a few relatives quietly fear that once old emotional wounds fully surface, some relationships may never recover completely. Others, however, reportedly believe avoiding honesty already caused enough damage. One insider described a divide this way:
Some people think truth risks breaking the family. Others think silence already did. That emotional disagreement reportedly shapes nearly every difficult interaction now, especially because no single solution exists emotionally for a family this large and complicated. Some relationships may rebuild slowly, others may remain distant. Some family members may grow closer through honesty, others may decide healthier boundaries matter more than emotional reconciliation. And according to sources, the uncertainty surrounding all those possibilities feels emotionally overwhelming at times. Still, sources say one major emotional change has already happened since the request that caught Kody off guard. The family is no longer speaking only in terms of obligation or shared history. People are finally discussing emotional needs openly. Needs like feeling valued, feeling emotionally safe, feeling heard, feeling prioritized, and feeling genuinely connected beyond appearances. And according to insiders, that emotional shift may permanently reshape the Brown family moving forward. Because once people begin asking whether relationships actually feel emotionally fulfilling, it becomes very difficult returning to silence afterward. Meanwhile, Kody reportedly continues trying to understand what rebuilding trust truly requires now. Not as a husband managing a plural family structure, but as an individual trying to reconnect emotionally with separate people carrying separate experiences and separate emotional wounds. And according to sources close to the family, that may ultimately become the hardest emotional challenge he has ever faced. By the time several weeks had passed since the emotional request that caught Kody Brown off guard, insiders say something subtle but important had started changing inside the Brown family. People were no longer pretending emotional distance was temporary. And according to sources close to the family, that honesty, while painful, was beginning to create a different kind of emotional atmosphere than the family had experienced for years. Not necessarily happier, not fully healed, but more emotionally real. One insider reportedly explained, "For the first time in a long time, people stopped performing emotional closeness and started talking about what actually feels broken." That shift reportedly changed conversations across multiple relationships inside the family. Some relatives became more open emotionally, others pulled back temporarily to process difficult feelings privately. And according to insiders, nearly everyone began recognizing that rebuilding emotional trust would require much more patience than anyone originally hoped. Because emotional damage that develops slowly over decades rarely heals quickly, especially inside a family as emotionally layered and complicated as the Browns. Meanwhile, Kody reportedly continued making quiet efforts to reconnect individually with certain family members after realizing how much emotional meaning small consistent actions now carry. Sources say he began initiating more one-on-one communication instead of relying on group settings or broad family updates. Simple conversations, checking in privately, listening more carefully. And according to insiders, while some relatives remain cautious, others reportedly appreciated seeing emotional effort instead of emotional defensiveness. One insider explained, he realized he stopped trying to control conversations as much and started trying to understand them. That emotional shift reported mattered more than Kody initially realized, because according to insiders, many family members no longer want solutions immediately. They want acknowledgement, recognition, emotional validation. And sources say learning how to offer that consistently has become one of Kody's biggest emotional adjustments lately. Especially because several adult children reportedly continue describing family experiences that emotionally surprise him. Not because they are attacking him intentionally, but because their emotional memories often focus on moments he barely recognized as significant at the time. One insider described the situation this way. He remembers carrying responsibility. Some children remember carrying emotional loneliness. That emotional contradiction reportedly continues affecting Kody deeply, because according to insiders, he genuinely believes sacrifice automatically translated into emotional security for the family overall. Now, however, several relatives appear increasingly willing to discuss how emotional connections sometimes weakened even during years when everyone remained physically together. That realization reportedly creates moments of sadness and confusion privately for him. Meanwhile, Kody Brown reportedly believes the family's current emotional honesty, while uncomfortable, may ultimately prevent even deeper long-term emotional separation. According to sources close to Kody, she increasingly sees the recent conversations as necessary emotional growing pains, rather than signs the family is doomed completely. One insider reportedly explained, Kody thinks people finally stopped pretending survival and emotional fulfillment are the same thing. That distinction reportedly changed how many relatives now view family relationships entirely, because for years survival often came first, keeping peace, managing chaos, maintaining structure, avoiding conflict. Now emotional quality matters more than appearance. And according to insiders, that shift feels both healthy and emotionally destabilizing at the same time, especially for older family members who spent decades believing sacrifice and endurance would naturally create closeness eventually. Meanwhile, Janelle Brown reportedly remains one of the few people consistently trying to balance honesty with emotional steadiness. Sources say Janelle increasingly encourages family members not to view emotional discomfort as proof conversations are failing. According to insiders, she believes healing often begins precisely when people finally stop avoiding difficult truths. However, sources also claim Janelle understands why many relatives still feel emotionally exhausted by the process, because honesty can be emotionally draining, especially when it forces people to rethink years of family history through entirely different perspectives. One insider explained, everybody's reinterpreting old memories now, and that can be emotionally overwhelming. That emotional reevaluation reportedly affects nearly every branch of the family. Some relatives reportedly feel relief finally understanding why certain relationships became distant. Others feel grief realizing emotional disconnect started much earlier than they once believed. and some people still struggle emotionally accepting that love and emotional harm sometimes existed inside the same